If you ever find a perfectly clean pair of children's shoes sitting on a mossy log 20 miles from the nearest trailhead, don't look for the kid, just run, and for the love of God, do not look back. I'm Marcus Vance, a 42-year-old former senior park ranger. I spent 10 years patrolling the deepest, most unforgiving corners of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. I've seen what a grizzly can do to a campsite, and I've pulled hikers out of ravines who looked like they'd been through a meat grinder. Those are things that fit into a report. I'm talking to you today because there are pages in my old logs that I never submitted, pages that would have gotten me a psych eval and a one-way ticket out of the service. I'm currently living in a small, flat town in the Midwest where the nearest tree is a mile away, and yet I still find myself checking the locks every time the wind picks up. You see, when you spend a decade in the high country, you develop a sense. It's not supernatural, it's primal. It's that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched long before your eyes catch a movement. For the first 5 years, I dismissed it as nerves. By year 10, I knew it was survival. The wilderness isn't just a collection of trees and rocks, it's an entity. And sometimes, that entity gets hungry for things it shouldn't know exist. My first real unexplainable happened 3 years in. You were looking for a 6-year-old boy named Toby. He'd vanished while his parents were setting up a tent at a designated campground. Not the backcountry, mind you, but a high-traffic area. One second he was playing with a plastic truck. The next, he was gone. No scream, no rustle of brush. Just an empty space where a child used to be. We ran a standard search and rescue grid. I was leading a team of 4 volunteers about 5 miles out from the point of disappearance. The terrain was brutal vertical climbs and thick deadfall. We reached a plateau that, by all logic, a 6-year-old couldn't have reached in the 2 hours since he'd gone missing. And there, in the middle of a pristine patch of snow that hadn't been touched by wind or animal, were Toby's boots. They were tucked neatly side by side, laces tied, pointing toward the north. There were no footprints leading to them, none leading away. It was as if he'd been lowered from the sky, stepped out of his shoes, and vanished upward. I remember the radio silence when I called it in. My supervisor, a guy named Miller who'd been in the service since the 70s, didn't ask for coordinates. He just said, "Leave 'em, Marcus, mark the GPs, and move to the next grid. Do not touch the boots." We never found Toby, but 2 weeks later, Miller retired without a word to anyone. He just left his badge on his desk and moved to Arizona. People think the stairs in the woods stories are just internet creepypasta. I wish they were. I found my first set about 7 years into my career. I was deep in the Selway Bitterroot wilderness, chasing a report of an illegal campfire. I was miles from any trail, in a valley so dense the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. And there they were, a flight of white marble stairs, maybe 10 steps high, ending in a small landing. No house, no ruins, no foundation, just perfectly clean, polished marble that looked like it belonged in a courthouse in D.C. The air around them felt heavy, like the pressure you feel in your ears before a massive thunderstorm. The birds were silent, and in the woods, total silence is a death knell. I've seen rangers who've walked up those stairs. They don't come back the same. They get this hollow look in their eyes, like the person you knew left and something else is just wearing your skin. I didn't touch them. I didn't even get within 20 feet. I just turned around and hiked 6 hours back to my truck in the dark. I'd rather face a mountain lion in the pitch black than whatever was waiting at the top of that landing. But the event that finally broke me happened in the autumn of my final year. I was stationed at a remote fire lookout tower, the kind that's perched on a needle of rock, accessible only by a grueling hike. It was a quiet season, or so I thought. About 3 in the morning, the radio crackled to life. It was static at first, that rhythmic hiss pop that usually means a storm is rolling in. Then a voice came through. It was my own voice. "Marcus, you there? I'm at the base of the tower. I forgot my keys. Can you let me in?" My blood turned to ice. I was looking at the radio, and I was looking at the trapdoor to the tower, which was bolted from the inside. I wasn't downstairs. I was right here. The voice was identical. The same gravelly tone. The same slight Montana drawl. "Marcus, it's cold out here, man. Open up." I didn't answer. I grabbed my service pistol and sat in the center of the room, away from the windows. The voice started getting more insistent. It started saying things only I would know. Details about my divorce, the name of my dog that died when I was 12. It wasn't just mimicking my voice, it was mimicking my life. Then the scratching started. Not at the door, but on the outside of the tower walls. We're talking about a structure that's 60 feet in the air on a sheer cliff face. Whatever was out there was climbing the vertical wood siding like an insect. I could hear it circling the glass, its long, spindly fingers tapping against the panes. Tap, 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 tap. "I can see you, Marcus," the voice whispered. This time, it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from right outside the glass, inches from my head. I didn't look. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor and prayed for the sun to rise. When the first rays of light finally hit the peaks, the tapping stopped. The heavy feeling in the air evaporated. I waited until noon before I dared to look out the window. There were no footprints on the ground below, but on the glass of the observation deck there were smudges, oily, translucent handprints with far too many joints in the fingers. I hiked out that day. I didn't even pack my gear. I told the supervisor I'd had a heart scare and needed to get to a hospital. He looked at my face, saw the way my hands were shaking, and he didn't ask a single question. He just nodded, took my keys, and told me to stay out of the trees. That's the thing about the national parks that the brochures don't tell you. We protect the land, sure, but a big part of a ranger's job, the part they don't put in the recruitment videos, is to act as a buffer. We are the thin green line between the public and the things that have lived in those woods since the glaciers receded. There are places in this country where the map just stops, where the laws of physics and biology don't apply. I've heard the theories. Feral humans, interdimensional rifts, ancient spirits. Personally, I don't think it matters what they are. What matters is that they're there and they're curious. They've spent thousands of years watching us from the shadows, learning how we speak, how we think, and how we disappear. I remember a guy I worked with, a veteran named Elias. He'd been a ranger for 30 years. One night, over a flask of coffee, he told me that the woods have a way of folding. He said sometimes a person walks behind a tree, and the space behind that tree just doesn't lead back to our world. He called them soft spots. He told me that if I ever felt like the forest was becoming a copy of itself, like the trees were repeating in a pattern, I should stop immediately, close my eyes, and hum a song I knew by heart until the feeling passed. I laughed at him then. I don't laugh now. I still have dreams about the bitterroot. In the dreams, I'm back in that lookout tower. The scratching is back, but this time, the glass isn't holding. This time, the voice isn't just mine. It's a chorus of everyone who ever went missing on my watch. Toby, the hikers, the old man who wandered off a trail in '94. They're all out there calling my name, asking me why I didn't find them. The worst part isn't the fear. It's the realization that we are intruders. We build our trails and our visitor centers, and we think we've conquered the wild. But you can't conquer something that doesn't play by your rules. The forest is patient. It can wait 100 years for you to take a wrong turn, to trip over a root, or to let your curiosity get the better of you when you see a set of stairs that shouldn't exist. I'm telling you this not to scare you away from nature, but to make you respect it. If you're hiking and the woods go silent, don't stop to take a picture. If you see something that doesn't make sense, a Victorian dresser in a swamp, a telephone ringing in a clearing, or a familiar face where it couldn't possibly be turned around, the rangers know. We've always known. We just don't want to start a panic. Because if people knew how many unsolved disappearances were actually unexplainable erasures, nobody would ever set foot in a park again. I'm Marcus Vance, and I'm 42 years old. I used to be a park ranger. Now, I'm just a man who stays in the light. Because I know what's waiting in the dark and I know it remembers my voice. Stay on the trail, keep your eyes on the ground. And if you hear me calling your name from the brush, keep walking, because I promise you, I'm nowhere near those woods. Story 2. They say the woods have a way of swallowing people whole, but they never tell you about the things the woods spit back out, or the things they keep hidden in their throat, just to see if you're brave enough to reach for them. I'm Jackson Jax Miller, a 34-year-old land surveyor working out of Port Angeles, Washington. For the last decade, my life has been defined by GPA's coordinates, topographical maps, and the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Olympic Peninsula. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. I deal in elevations, property lines, and granite. But 3 weeks ago, while surveying a deep interior no man's land near the Hoh Rainforest for a private conservation group, I found something that doesn't exist on any map. It shouldn't exist at all. It's thick, smelling of damp cedar and something older, something like wet stone and ancient rot. I was 5 miles past the last marked trail, pushing through a dense thicket of devil's club and ferns that grew higher than my waist when the silence hit me. In the woods, silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's a physical weight. The birds stopped mid-song. The wind, which had been whipping the Douglas firs into a frenzy, simply died. That's when I saw it. Nestled in a natural depression between 2 jagged ridges was a cabin. Now, finding an old trapper's shack isn't unusual in these parts, but this was different. This wasn't a shack. It was a 2-story structure made of dark, almost blackened timber, looking as though it had been scorched by fire and then weathered by a century of rain. The architecture was wrong. The angles were too sharp, the windows too narrow, and the front door was painted a shade of red so vibrant it looked like fresh blood against the emerald moss. My gut told me to turn around. My surveyor's instinct, that obsessive need to categorize and record, told me to move closer. I checked my GPS. The screen flickered, the coordinates jumping wildly before the display bled into static. I was off the grid, in every sense of the word. I approached the red door. There were no tracks leading to it, no signs of life, yet the porch was eerily clean. No fallen leaves, no pine needles. It was as if the forest itself was afraid to touch it. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and pushed. The door didn't creak, it swung open with a smooth, silent, heavy grace that suggested the hinges had been oiled this morning. "Hello," I called out. My voice felt small, swallowed instantly by the shadows inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of an abandoned house. There was no dust, no musty scent of stagnant air. Instead, it smelled like ozone and lilies, the kind of cloying sweetness you find at a funeral home. I stepped inside, my boots thudding against floorboards that felt unnaturally solid. The interior was furnished, but not in a way that made sense. There was a dining table set for 4, with fine china and silverware polished to a mirror shine. In the center of the table sat a bowl of fruit. I leaned in, my heart hammering against my ribs. The apples were wax perfect, but when I touched one it was ice cold, not refrigerated cold, dead cold. As I moved through the ground floor, the wrongness intensified. I found a library filled with books whose spines bore no titles. I pulled one off the shelf and opened it. The pages were blank, yet they felt heavy, as if the words were just beneath the surface, waiting for the right light to reveal them. Then I saw the stairs. They spiraled upward into a darkness that my high-lumen tactical light couldn't seem to pierce. I'm a rational man, or at least I was. I told myself I was looking for a resident, someone who might need help. But as I climbed, the air grew thinner, colder. On the second floor, there was only one door. A hand-carved crib sat in the center of the room, draped in white lace that looked brand new. On the walls, someone had painted a mural. It wasn't a mural of animals or fairy tales. It was a map, a perfect, hyper-detailed topographical map of the very woods I was standing in. But there were marks on it, red dots scattered across the terrain. I leaned in, my breath hitching. I recognized the locations. Those red dots, they were the exact coordinates of every person who had gone missing in the Olympic National Park over the last 50 years. I saw the spot where a hiker vanished in 1974. I saw the ridge where a young girl disappeared 3 years ago. And then my blood turned to ice. In the far corner of the map, right where I was currently standing, there was a new dot. The paint was still wet. A single drop of red was slowly sliding down the wall, marking my exact position. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my light cutting through the gloom. Nothing, just the empty hallway, but the atmosphere had shifted. The funeral smell was gone, replaced by the unmistakable scent of wood smoke and sweat. Someone or something was in the house with me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. I didn't wait for an answer. I bolted for the stairs. As I descended, the layout of the house seemed to stretch. The hallway felt longer, the ceiling higher. I reached the ground floor and headed for the front door, but it wasn't there. Where the red door had been, there was now only a solid wall of blackened timber. I panicked. I threw my weight against the wood, kicking and screaming, but it was like hitting a mountain. I turned back toward the dining room, and my heart nearly stopped. The table was no longer empty. A man was sitting there. He was dressed in a surveyor's vest, just like mine. His back was to me, his head bowed as if in prayer. "Hey," I yelled, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from a side table. "Who are you? How do I get out of here?" The man didn't move. Slowly, he began to speak, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "You're late, Jackson," he said. I froze. "How do you know my name?" He began to turn. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. As his face came into the light, I felt a scream tear at my throat, but no sound came out. The man didn't have a face, not in the way we do. Where his eyes and mouth should have been, there were only smooth, pale indentations, like a statue that had been worn down by centuries of water. But he was wearing a name tag, a tarnished, silver name tag that I recognized instantly. It belonged to my brother, Leo. Leo had disappeared 12 years ago. He was the reason I became a surveyor. He was the reason I spent every weekend in these woods searching for a sign, a scrap of clothing, anything. "Leo," I whispered, the candlestick slipping from my numb fingers and clattering to the floor. The faceless man stood up. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, the same one Leo always carried. He set it on the table and pushed it toward me. "The woods don't take," the thing that looked like my brother whispered. "The woods trade." One SS, beloved form. The walls began to vibrate, and the floor tilted at a sickening angle. I saw the red door reappear, but it was translucent, flickering like a dying light bulb. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I lunged for the door, my shoulder hitting the wood with enough force to nearly dislocate it. I tumbled out onto the porch and kept running. I didn't look for the trail. I didn't check my compass. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I collapsed in a clearing miles away, the sun finally beginning to dip below the horizon. I made it back to my truck by dawn, my clothes torn, my skin mapped with scratches. I drove straight to the ranger station in Port Angeles. I told them everything, the cabin, the map, the thing that looked like Leo. They sent a search and rescue team out the next day. I led them. I knew exactly where I was. I had my GPA's coordinates, my landmarks, my years of experience. We hiked for 10 hours. We found the depression between the two ridges. We found the thicket of Devil's Club, but the cabin was gone. In its place was a circle of ancient blackened stumps arranged in the exact dimensions of the house. No red door, no nursery, no map. The rangers looked at me with a mix of pity and concern. They thought I'd had a breakdown, exhaustion, dehydration, the lingering trauma of Leo's disappearance. They escorted me back and told me to take some time off, but they didn't see what I found in my pocket when I got home. I reached into my surveyor's vest to grab my keys, and my fingers brushed against something cold and hard. I pulled it out. It was Leo's silver name tag. It was bent and tarnished, just as I'd seen it in the cabin. But there was something else. Inside my vest pocket was the leather-bound notebook. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the cover. I opened it to the last page. There, in my own handwriting I don't remember recording, was a list of coordinates. The first set of coordinates was for the clearing where I'd found the cabin. The second set was for my own house. And the third set of coordinates is for a location I'm supposed to visit tomorrow. It's a spot deep in the woods, further than I've ever gone. Next to the coordinates, there's a single note written in red ink. The trade is not yet complete. I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I smell the lilies in the ozone. I hear the sound of a red door swinging open on silent hinges. I know I shouldn't go. I know I should burn the notebook and move as far away from the Olympic Peninsula as I can. But tonight, when I looked in the mirror, I noticed something. My eyes. They look a little paler than they did yesterday. The edges of my features seem a bit softer, as if I'm being slowly erased. The woods are calling for their due. And out here, in the deep green silence, there's no such thing as a fair trade. I can hear the wind picking up outside my window now, even though the trees are perfectly still. It's whispering my name. It's whispering that it's time to go back. Because the mystery of the cabin isn't what's inside it. The mystery is what you become once you've walked through that red door. And I think, deep down, I've already left the best parts of myself behind in that nursery, staring at a map that never ends. If you're ever out in the hoe, and the birds stop singing, and you smell funeral flowers in the middle of a cedar grove, don't look for the red door. Just turn around, run until you hit the ocean. Because the woods are hungry, and they've been waiting a long time to finish the map. Story 3. The worst mistake you can make in the deep woods isn't getting lost. It's being found by something that's been practicing your name. I'm Marcus Vance, a 34-year-old former search and rescue technician currently living in the dense, fog-heavy foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. I've spent the better part of a decade pulling people out of the brush, some alive, some just memories, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the forest has a way of filtering out the people who don't respect its silence. I used to be a man of science, a man of maps and GPS coordinates, until a humid Tuesday night in August changed everything I thought I knew about the food chain. You see, in the SAR community, we have these unspoken rules. They don't teach them in the academy, and you won't find them in the handbooks, but you hear them whispered over lukewarm coffee at 3000 am. Rule number 1, if you see a set of stairs in the middle of the woods, you don't go near them. Rule number 2, If you hear a woman screaming for help but the voice doesn't move, you don't go looking. And the most important rule of all, the one that keeps us sane, is this: if you hear a whistle in the forest at night, you do not, under any circumstances, whistle back. And you definitely don't follow it. It started around 9:45 p.m. I was off duty, staying at a remote cabin near the Pisgah National Forest to clear my head after a particularly brutal recovery mission. The air was thick enough to chew on, smelling of damp earth and rotting hemlock. I was sitting on the porch, the orange cherry of my cigarette the only light for miles, watching the tree line melt into a wall of absolute black. That's when I heard it. It was a 3-note melody, clear, crisp. It sounded like a person, maybe a hiker whistling a casual, upbeat tune. Do-re-mi. I froze. My SAR instincts flared up instantly. At this hour, in this terrain, nobody is just casually whistling. If you're out there, you're either in trouble or you're the trouble. I stood up, the floorboards of the porch groaning under my weight. I strained my ears, waiting for a follow-up. A shout, a cry for help, a snapping branch. But there was nothing, just the oppressive hum of the cicadas, which seemed to get louder, almost frantic, as if they were trying to drown something out. Then it came again, same 3 notes, but this time it was closer. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile against the vastness of the woods. This is Marcus Vance with Search and Rescue. I'm an EMT. If you're hurt, stay where you are and keep making noise. The whistling stopped. The forest went dead silent. And when I say silent, I mean the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight on your eardrums. The cicadas stopped. The wind died. Even the rustle of the leaves seemed to freeze in midair. It was the Oz effect, that terrifying moment where nature realizes something is wrong and holds its breath. I should have gone inside. I should have locked the door, grabbed my sidearm, and waited for the sun. But in my line of work, you don't ignore the possibility of a life in danger. I grabbed my high-lumen tactical flashlight and stepped off the porch. My boots crunched over a carpet of dead pine needles and skeletal leaves, the kind of sound that feels like a gunshot when the world is holding its breath. I hiked about 50 yards into the brush, the beam of my light cutting a violent white path through the darkness. The trees here were old-growth gnarled oaks and towering pines that seemed to lean inward, crowding the narrow trail. I kept calling out, but the only response was the rhythmic thud of my own heart in my ears. Whistle. It was behind me now. To the left. It was the same 3 notes, but the pitch was slightly off metallic, like air being pushed through a pipe that wasn't quite hollow. It didn't sound like it was coming from a throat. It sounded like a recording being played through a broken speaker. I spun around, sweeping my light in a wide arc. "I see you!" I lied, my voice cracking. "Come out with your hands up." Just the trunks of trees reflecting the light, looking like bleached ribs. I started to feel that primal itch at the base of my skull, the one that tells you you're being hunted. It's a survival mechanism we all have, a remnant from when our ancestors were being stalked by saber-toothed tigers. My skin felt cold despite the humidity. I decided to turn back. I wasn't equipped for a night search, and something about the cadence of that whistle felt predatory. But as I turned to head toward the cabin, I realized the trail was gone. Now, I've navigated these woods for a decade. I know every ridge, every creek bed, every rock formation. But in the span of 5 minutes, the forest had shifted. The familiar path had been swallowed by a dense thicket of briars and laurel that looked like it had been growing there for a century. Whistle. It was right in front of me now. Close. Maybe 20 feet away. My flashlight beam hit a cluster of trees, and for a split second, I saw it. It wasn't a person. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and impossibly thin. It was standing behind a massive oak, its body partially obscured. Its skin wasn't skin. It looked like wet, gray parchment stretched over a frame of mismatched bones. But it was the face that stopped my breath. It had no nose, no ears, just 2 wide, milky eyes that didn't reflect the light of my flash. And a mouth that was far too wide, pulled back into a permanent, jagged grin that showed rows of small, needle-like teeth. It didn't move. It just watched me. And then, without moving its lips, it whistled. The sound didn't come from its mouth. It came from its chest, a hollow, vibrating resonance that made the air around me tremble. Do-re-mi. I didn't think. I ran. I tore through the brush, ignoring the thorns that ripped at my face and the branches that whipped across my eyes. I could hear it behind me. It wasn't running like a human. It was moving with a sickening, fluid grace, like a spider skittering across a web. It didn't make a sound when it hit the ground. No heavy footsteps, no snapping twigs. Just the occasional whistle, growing louder and more distorted with every second. I skidded to a halt, nearly tripping over a fallen log. The voice was mine. It was my own voice, the exact tone I had used moments ago when I called out from the porch. Marcus, I'm Marcus Vance, I'm Ent. It was mimicking me. It wasn't just whistling anymore, it was learning. It was sampling my voice, playing it back to me with a mocking rhythmic tilt. The sheer wrongness of it sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. I realized then that this thing wasn't just a predator, it was a mimic. It used the sounds of safety, a whistle, a familiar voice, a cry for help, to lure its prey into the deep, dark places where no one would hear the screaming. I reached a clearing, a small patch of moonlight breaking through the canopy. I looked back, my chest heaving, my lungs burning with the metallic taste of blood. The thing was perched on a low-hanging branch of a hemlock tree, crouching like a gargoyle. It was tilted to the side, watching me with those dead, white eyes. It opened its mouth. And this time, the sound that came out wasn't a whistle or a voice. It was the sound of my own cabin door creaking open. Then, the sound of my floorboards groaning. It was telling me that it had been there. It was telling me that I was never safe, not even inside. I realized I was holding my tactical light like a weapon. I remembered an old piece of lore from a Cherokee elder I'd met years ago. He told me that the things in these mountains, the old ones, don't like the light of the sun, and they certainly don't like the false sun we carry in our hands. I didn't have a gun, but I had 1,200 lumens of concentrated lead light. As the creature leaped from the branch, a blur of gray limbs and needle teeth, I didn't run. I stood my ground, aimed the light directly at its face, and hit the strobe setting. The effect was instantaneous. The creature let out a sound that I can only describe as a chorus of 1,000 dying birds. It shrieked, a high-pitched, vibrating wail that felt like it was tearing my eardrums apart. It collapsed to the ground, clawing at its eyes, its body twisting and contorting in ways that defied physics. In the flickering strobe light, it looked like it was glitching, its form shifting between a man, a deer, and something much, much older. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction of the shriek. I didn't look for a trail. I just moved toward the faint, distant glow of what I hoped was the main road. I ran until my legs felt like lead, until my vision blurred, until I burst out onto the asphalt of Highway 2076. I didn't stop until I saw the headlights of a passing truck. I flagged it down, nearly getting hit in the process. The driver, a grizzled old man hauling timber, looked at me like I was a ghost. I probably looked like one covered in blood, sweat, and dirt, my eyes wide with a terror that no man should ever feel. He asked, leaning out the window. I couldn't speak. I just pointed back toward the woods. "Hear a whistle, did ya?" he said, his voice dropping an octave. He didn't wait for an answer. He just unlocked the passenger door and told me to get in. As we drove away, I looked into the side mirror. Deep in the tree line, just where the light of the truck faded into the dark, I saw 2 white, unblinking circles, and then, faintly over the roar of the engine, I heard it, one last time. Durami. I moved closer to the city, away from the shadows and the silence of the mountains. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't even like going into my backyard after the sun goes down. People ask me why I left a career I was so good at. I tell them I just got tired of the stress. But the truth is, I can't stand the sound of the wind through the trees anymore, because every time the breeze picks up, or a bird calls out in the twilight, I find myself listening. I find myself waiting for that 3-note melody. So if you're ever out in the woods and the sun starts to dip below the horizon, pay attention. If the cicadas go quiet, if the air feels heavy, and if you hear a whistle that sounds just a little too perfect, don't be a hero. Don't look for the source. Turn around, keep your eyes on the ground, and walk. Don't run back to your car. Because out there in the dark, something is listening, something is learning. And if you whistle back, you're not just making noise, you're giving it permission to find you. Trust me. Some things in the forest aren't looking for help. They're looking for a voice to steal. Story 4. I've spent 12 years pulling people out of the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for the day the forest tried to pull me in. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 34 years old, and for the last decade I've worked as a lead search and rescue SAR officer in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, right in the heart of Washington State. It's a job that demands a certain level of stoicism. You see things, mangled remains from animal attacks, hikers who succumb to the elements, and the hollowed-out eyes of parents who realize their child isn't coming home. You learn to compartmentalize the shadows. You learn that the woods aren't magical or spiritual. They're indifferent. They're a massive breathing machine that doesn't care if you live or die, or at least that's what I told myself until 3 weeks ago. The call came in at 4:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. A 22-year-old hiker named Chloe had vanished near the Goat Rocks Wilderness. Her boyfriend reported that she'd stepped away from their tent to see the sunrise and never came back. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the mist was so thick you could taste the iron in the damp air. It was that classic Pacific Northwest gloom, the kind of gray that swallows colors and muffles sound. I geared up, checking my radio, my GPS, and my heavy-duty flashlight. I've hiked these trails thousands of times. I know the shortcuts, the seasonal streams, and the places where the terrain likes to trick the eye. But as I pushed deeper into the brush, leaving the established trail behind to follow a faint set of prints in the mud, the atmosphere shifted. It was a slow, creeping realization that the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. Have you ever been in the woods when the birds stop? It's called the Oz effect. It's a biological red flag. Usually it means a predator is nearby, a cougar or a bear. I unsnapped the holster of my bear spray and slowed my pace, my boots crunching softly on the carpet of pine needles. But as I scanned the tree line, I didn't see a predator. I saw something that shouldn't have been there. About 50 yards ahead, nestled between two ancient, towering Douglas firs, was a flash of brilliant, pristine white. I stopped dead. My first thought was that it was a piece of debris, maybe a weather balloon or a fallen piece of a plane. I adjusted my pack and moved closer, my heart beginning a slow, rhythmic thud against my ribs. As the mist parted, the object came into focus, and my brain struggled to process the image. It was a staircase, not a ruined staircase from a long-abandoned cabin, not a set of wooden steps rotting into the earth. This was a freestanding, perfectly preserved flight of about 15 steps made of polished white marble. It looked like it had been plucked directly out of a high-end suburban mansion and dropped into the middle of the most inaccessible part of the wilderness. There was no foundation, no walls, no house, just the stairs rising out of the dirt and leading to a small, flat landing that looked out over nothing but more trees. "Dispatch, this is Reed," I whispered into my shoulder mic, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. I've found something unusual. Requesting a secondary GPS ping on my location. The radio hissed with static. "Copy, Reed. What are we looking at? Did you find the subject?" "Negative on the subject," I said, my eyes locked on the white marble. It was so clean it almost glowed against the dark forest floor. There wasn't a single leaf on the steps, no moss, no dirt. In a forest where everything is covered in a layer of decay, these stairs were surgically sterile. I found a structure, a set of stairs, marble, no surrounding buildings. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, the voice of my supervisor, Miller, came through. His tone had changed. It wasn't the usual professional clip. It was low, hushed, and laced with a warning I'd never heard from him before. "Reed, listen to me very carefully. Do not approach the structure. Mark the coordinates and continue your search for the subject. Do you copy?" "Miller, it's right here," I argued, a strange curiosity bubbling up in my chest. "It looks like it was put here yesterday. If Chloe found this, she might have climbed it." "She might be Marcus. Stay away from the stairs," Miller barked, using my first name for the first time in years. "That is an order. Mark it and move on." I should have listened. Every instinct I had as a survivalist told me to turn around. The air around the staircase felt heavy, like the pressure change you feel right before a massive thunderstorm. But there was something else, a hum. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, it was a vibration you felt in your teeth. I took a step forward, then another. The closer I got, the more the forest seemed to recede. The sound of the wind died. The smell of the damp earth vanished, replaced by a scent that was disturbingly familiar but out of place, the smell of ozone and expensive floor wax. I reached the base of the stairs. Up close, the craftsmanship was impossible. There were no seams. It was as if the entire thing had been carved from a single massive block of stone. I reached out a gloved hand and touched the banister. It was ice cold. Not morning in the woods cold, but liquid nitrogen cold. The chill bit through my heavy gloves instantly. I looked up. The stairs led to a landing about 10 feet in the air. From this angle, I could see through the gaps in the steps. There was nothing behind them, just the same trees, the same mist. And yet, there was a sense of profound height emanating from the top. Like I was standing at the edge of a skyscraper rather than a small flight of stairs. "Chloe," I called out. My voice didn't echo. It didn't even seem to travel. It just dropped flat to the ground, muffled by the oppressive silence. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the 4 a.m. call. Maybe it was the call of the void. That weird psychological urge humans get to jump when they're standing on a high ledge. I lifted my boot and placed it on the first step. The moment my weight shifted onto the marble, the world tilted. The trees didn't move, but the colors did. The deep greens of the firs bled into a sickly, bruised purple. The gray mist turned a caustic yellow. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I nearly retched into my mask. I looked down at my feet. My boots were no longer on marble. They were hovering over a void of swirling iridescent smoke. I froze. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would crack a rib. I looked back over my shoulder, expecting to see the forest floor I'd just stepped off of. It was gone. Behind me wasn't the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. It was a doorway, a rectangular frame of light hanging in the middle of a pitch-black expanse. Through that frame I could see my world, the mossy trees, my drop flashlight rolling on the ground. The reality I knew, but it was small, it was shrinking. I scrambled to turn around, but my limbs felt like they were moving through molasses. The hum in my teeth had turned into a scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated frequency that felt like it was trying to peel the skin off my bones. "Don't look up," a voice inside my head whispered. It wasn't my voice. It was deeper, older. Naturally, I looked up. At the top of the stairs on the landing that had previously been empty stood a figure. It wasn't Chloe. It wasn't even human. It was a tall, spindly thing draped in what looked like tattered funeral shrouds that didn't flutter. Despite a wind I couldn't feel, it had no face, just a smooth, porcelain-white surface where features should be. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just existed there at the top of the stairs, waiting. The thing raised a hand. Its fingers were too long, with too many knuckles, stretching out toward me like the pale branches of a dead tree. That broke the spell. The primal, lizard brain part of me took over. I didn't think. I didn't strategize. I lunged backward, throwing my entire body weight toward that shrinking rectangle of forest light. I fell. I didn't hit the stairs. I hit the dirt. Hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a second I just lay there, gasping, the taste of copper and pine needles filling my mouth. I scrambled to my feet, spinning around, my hand going for my bear spray, my knife, anything. The staircase was gone. There was no marble, no landing. Just the two Douglas firs, standing silent and indifferent in the mist. The forest sounds were back, the distant caw of a crow, the rustle of the wind through the canopy. It was as if the last 2 minutes had never happened. "Reed, Reed." Miller's voice exploded from my radio, distorted and panicked. I grabbed the mic, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. "I'm here. I'm here, Miller. I'm moving. I'm continuing the search." "Did you touch them?" Miller asked. The raw fear in his voice was palpable. "No," I lied. My chest was burning. "I didn't touch them. They're gone. I don't know where they went, but they're gone." I found Chloe 3 hours later. She was 3 miles away from the stairs, huddled in the hollow of a cedar tree. She was alive, but she was catatonic. When I carried her out on my back, she didn't say a word. She just stared over my shoulder, her eyes wide and fixed on the tree line. When we got back to the base camp, Miller was waiting for me. He didn't ask about the girl. He didn't ask about my injuries. He just walked up to me, looked at the scuff marks on my boots, white, powdery marble dust that hadn't quite brushed off, and sighed. "You're done for the season, Reed," he said quietly. "Take your leave. Go to the city. Stay out of the woods for a while." "What are they, Miller?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. "Those stairs. I'd heard the stories, the creepypastas, the urban legends. I thought they were just bored rangers making up ghost stories to scare the rookies. But that wasn't a story." But that wasn't a story. Miller looked at me, and for the first time I saw how old he really was. "The woods are older than we are, Marcus. We think we've mapped them. We think we own them because we put up signs and gravel trails. But there are places where the fabric gets thin, places where things leak through. Those stairs, they aren't stairs. They're bait. They're a way for something on the other side to see who's curious enough to climb." I haven't been back to the Gifford-Pinchot since that day. I moved to Seattle. I took a job in logistics, sitting in a windowless office, surrounded by concrete and steel. It's safe. It's loud. It's everything the forest isn't. But sometimes, when I'm walking up the stairs to my apartment, I'll stop. I'll feel a slight pressure change in the air. I'll smell a hint of ozone and floor wax. And for a split second, I'll look at the steps beneath my feet and wonder if they're still made of wood and carpet, or if they've turned into cold white marble while I wasn't looking. Because the worst part isn't what I saw at the top of those stairs. The worst part is the feeling I've had every day since. The feeling that even though I jumped back into my world, I didn't quite make it all the way. Like I'm still standing on that first step and the thing with the porcelain face is just waiting for me to realize that in the woods there's no such thing as nowhere. Everything leads somewhere. And once you've seen the door, it never really closes. I'm Marcus Reed, and if you ever find yourself deep in the brush, miles from the nearest trail, and you see something that doesn't belong, something clean, something white, something inviting, don't look at it, don't take a picture, and for the love of God, whatever you do, do not climb. Story 5. The most terrifying sound in the world isn't a scream, it's the sound of your wife's voice calling your name from the dark, when you know for a fact she's miles away. My name is Caleb Miller. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've worked as a freelance landscape photographer and forestry consultant. My job usually takes me to the most remote corners of the Pacific Northwest, where the trees are so thick they swallow the sunlight before it can even touch the moss. Right now, I'm writing this from our cabin on the edge of the Olympic National Forest in Washington. My wife, Sarah, is a wildlife biologist, and we moved out here for the solitude, for the silence, and for the proximity to the nature we both claim to love. But after what's been happening over the last 3 weeks, I've realized that silence isn't empty, it's a void. And something has been filling it with a voice that doesn't belong to it. It started on a Tuesday, one of those gray, drizzly afternoons where the mist hangs so low you can't see the tops of the Douglas firs. Shira had left 2 days prior for a field study up near the Hoh rainforest. She was supposed to be gone for 10 days, leaving me alone with our golden retriever, Buster, in a mountain of photo editing. I was sitting in my office, the blue light of the monitor the only thing illuminating the room, when I heard it. A soft, melodic call from the tree line just beyond our back deck. "Caleb, can you come here for a second?" I froze. My heart didn't just skip a beat, it felt like it stopped entirely. It was Sarah's voice. Not just a resemblance, but her exact pitch, that slight lilt she gets at the end of a question, and that specific way she breathes out my name. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood. My first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion. Maybe the study got rained out. Maybe she'd come home early to surprise me. I walked to the sliding glass door and peered out into the gloom. The forest was a wall of charcoal and deep green. I called out, sliding the door open. The damp air hit my face, smelling of cedar and wet earth. "Is that you? Why are you out there?" There was no answer, just the steady drip, drip, drip of rainwater falling from the eaves. Buster, who usually barks at a falling leaf, was huddled under my desk, his tail tucked so tightly against his stomach he was shaking. That should have been my first warning. Dogs know. They always know when the frequency of the world shifts into something it shouldn't be. "Caleb, it's so beautiful back here. Come look." The voice came again, but this time it was further back, deeper into the timber. It sounded playful, almost flirtatious. My skin crawled. It was too perfect. It was the exact tone she used when we were hiking and she'd found a rare orchid or a hidden waterfall. But Sarah wouldn't stay in the woods in the rain, calling me like a child playing hide and seek. She'd come inside. She'd be shivering and asking for coffee. I didn't go out. I locked the door, pulled the heavy curtains, and called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I told myself it was the terrain reception is spotty at best in the Hoh. I spent the rest of the night with every light in the house turned on, a kitchen knife on the nightstand, and Buster whimpering at the foot of the bed. By the third night, the Sarah in the woods stopped being playful. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting those long, jagged shadows that make the forest look like a row of teeth. I was in the kitchen making tea when the voice drifted through the vents. "Caleb, my ankle, I think it's broken. Please, Caleb, it hurts." It was a gut-wrenching sound. The voice was ragged, bubbling with a simulated pain that made my vision blur with adrenaline. I grabbed a high-powered tactical flashlight in my heavy coat. Every instinct told me my wife was out there, bleeding in the dark. I was halfway out the door when I remembered the GPS tracker Sarah carries for work. I scrambled for my laptop, my fingers fumbling over the keys. I logged into her professional portal. My breath hitched as the map loaded. The little green dot representing Sarah's transponder was exactly where it was supposed to be, 34 miles north, stationary at her base camp. I stood in the center of the kitchen, the house silent except for that agonizing sobbing coming from the trees. "Help me, it's so cold. Caleb, please." I walked to the window, but I didn't open it. I shouted through the glass. "I know you're not her. What are you?" The sobbing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. Then the voice changed. It didn't lose Sarah's tone, but it lost the humanity behind it. It started repeating my name, over and over, faster and faster, until it sounded like a skipping record. Caleb, 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 Caleb. Then, a new sound, a heavy rhythmic thump. Something was hitting the side of the house, not a hand, not a fist. It sounded like a large, wet sack of flour being swung against the wood. I retreated into the hallway, clutching the knife. The thumping moved from the back wall to the side, then to the front door. Buster was howling now, a sound of pure, unadulterated primal terror, and then the voice spoke again. This time, it wasn't Sarah. It was me. "I'm right here, Sarah. Open the door. I'm right here." It was my own voice, played back to me with terrifying precision. It had heard me shouting at it moments ago, and it had already mastered the vibration of my vocal cords. It was mocking me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the bathtub, the only room without windows, with the dog and a shotgun I'd forgotten I even owned, tucked away in the back of the closet. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a person. A person can't mimic a voice they just heard with 100% accuracy. A person doesn't move through the undergrowth without making a sound other than the voice they're stealing. The next morning I found the gifts. On the porch, laid out in a neat symmetrical line, were 3 dead crows. Their necks had been elongated, pulled until the skin snapped, making them look like miniature feathered versions of something that didn't belong on this earth. Beside them, written in the frost on the glass door, was a single word. Spent the day boarding up the lower windows. I felt like a madman, hammering plywood into the frames of a beautiful custom-built home, but every time I looked toward the trees, I felt eyes on me. Not animal eyes. Something colder, something that was studying me, learning the way I moved, the way I sighed when I was frustrated, the way I muttered to myself. Sarah was supposed to be back in 3 days. I had to get out. I packed a bag, threw Buster into the truck and turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even click. I popped the hood and nearly threw up. The wiring hadn't just been chewed or cut, it had been woven. The spark plug wires, the battery cables. They had been intricately braided together into a complex, sickening pattern that looked like a bird's nest made of copper and rubber. It was deliberate. It was artistic. I was trapped. That evening, the mist didn't just stay in the trees, it rolled onto the lawn, thick and suffocating. I stayed in the living room, the wood stove roaring. I needed the noise of the fire to drown out the woods. But the thing in the trees had learned that I wasn't coming out for Sarah's voice anymore. It needed a new hook. "Caleb, do you remember the cabin in Vermont?" The voice was back to being Sarah, but it was whispering now, as if it were right outside the thin plywood on the window. My heart hammered against my ribs. Vermont, that was our honeymoon. We'd never told anyone the details of that trip. How could it know? The way the rain sounded on the tin roof. The voice continued. "The way you promised you'd never let anything happen to me." It was reciting our private conversations. It wasn't just mimicking sounds, it was harvesting something deeper. I realized with a jolt of horror that it hadn't just been watching us since we moved here. It had been listening for months, maybe years. It had been a silent passenger in our lives, waiting for the moment Sarah left so it could try on her skin, or at least her voice. "Go away," I screamed, firing a round from the shotgun through the plywood. The blast was deafening in the small room. Outside, there was a high-pitched, warbling shriek, a sound that started as a woman's scream and ended as the screech of a rusted gate. I heard something heavy retreating into the brush, snapping branches the size of my arm as it went. For a moment, I felt a surge of triumph. I'd heard it. I'd driven it back. But then, the laughter started. It started as one voice, Sarah's laughter. Then it was joined by my own laughter. Then the laughter of my father, who died 10 years ago. Then a chorus of voices, hundreds of them, all laughing in perfect, terrifying unison from every direction in the forest. The woods were alive with the sound of 1,000 stolen people. I realized then that this thing wasn't alone, or maybe it was just one thing that could be everywhere at once. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hypervigilance that felt like a fever dream. I didn't eat. I barely drank. I watched the tree line through the cracks in the plywood. I saw movement flashes of something pale and spindly, something that moved with too many joints, shifting between the trunks of the firs. It stayed just out of focus, a blur of white against the deep green. On the final night before Sarah was due back, the forest went dead silent. No wind, no crickets, no mimicry. The silence was worse than the voices. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Around 3000 am, there was a soft knock at the door, not the frantic thumping from before. A rhythmic, polite knock. "Caleb, honey, I'm home. The truck broke down a mile back. Can you let me in? It's freezing." I froze. I crept toward the door, the shotgun leveled at the wood. I looked at the GPA's laptop. The green dot was moving. It was on the road leading to our house. It was a mile away. "Sarah," I whispered. "Yes, baby. It's me. Please, I've had such a long walk." My phone died. "Just open the door." It sounded so real. The exhaustion in her voice, the slight tremor from the cold. It was perfect. It was too perfect. "Tell me something only you would know," I said, my voice cracking. "It's freezing out here. We have that secret stash of bourbon in the floorboard under the rug. Let me in and we'll have a drink." My hand reached for the deadbolt. She knew about the bourbon. Only we knew about that. I started to turn the lock. Then I stopped. I looked at Buster. The dog wasn't at the door wagging his tail. He was backed into the corner of the kitchen, his fur standing on end, his eyes rolled back so far you could only see the whites. He was emitting a low, guttural growl I'd never heard before. I looked back at the door. "Sarah, what's the name of the dog we had before Buster?" The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Caleb, just open the door." The voice was losing its edge. The Sarah mask was slipping. "What was his name?" I yelled. "Open the door." The voice was now a deep, vibrating rumble that shook the floorboards. I didn't open it. I backed away. Outside, I heard a sound like wet leather stretching. A face, or what I think was a face, pressed against the small, unblocked window at the very top of the door. It was pale, devoid of a nose or ears, with a mouth that was far too wide and filled with rows of needle-like teeth. But the eyes were hers. It had mimicked Sarah's eyes. I fired the shotgun through the door. A horrific, gurgling howl erupted from the other side. I heard something heavy fall off the porch and scramble into the darkness. I stayed there, aimed at the door, until the sun crested the mountains. At 8,000 am, a real truck pulled into the driveway. I saw it through the crack, Sarah's actual company vehicle. She got out, looking tired but whole, waving at the house. I ran outside, screaming for her to stay in the car. I checked her. I checked the GPEs. I made her tell me the name of our first dog. It was Barnaby, and I made her show me the birthmark on her shoulder. It was her. Really her? We didn't stay to pack. We left with the clothes on our backs and the dog. Sarah didn't believe me at first, not until she saw the braided wires in my truck and the claw marks, 6 inches deep, gouged into the solid oak of our front door. We're staying in a motel in Seattle now. The police went out there, but they found nothing. No footprints, no blood, no pale thing. Just a quiet cabin in the woods. But here's why I'm writing this. Last night, in the middle of the city, surrounded by millions of people and the hum of traffic, I heard it. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. Sarah was asleep in the other room, and from the vent in the ceiling, a soft, familiar voice whispered, "Caleb, we're not finished. Come back to the trees." It wasn't Sarah's voice this time. It was mine. Story 6. The forest doesn't have a voice, but it has a way of screaming that stays with you long after you've left the tree line and returned to the safety of the streetlights. My name is Caleb Miller. I'm 41 years old, and for 12 years I served as a senior park ranger in the deepest, most unforgiving sectors of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. I've spent more nights under a canopy of ancient pines than I have under a roof, and I've tracked everything from stray hikers to rogue grizzlies. You learn to trust your senses out there. You learn that the wind has a certain smell before a storm, and that the silence of the birds is the only warning you'll get when a predator is near. But there are things I encountered, things documented in files that will never see the light of day, that defy every law of nature I was trained to uphold. I didn't quit because I was tired of the cold or the isolation. I quit because I realized that in the deep woods, we aren't the ones at the top of the food chain. The first time I realized the woods were wrong was in my 3rd year. We were looking for a missing hiker, a 24-year-old marathon runner named Elias. He had gone out for a routine trail run on a well-marked path and simply vanished. By the time I was called in, he'd been gone for 48 hours. I was paired with a veteran named Miller, no relation, just a guy who'd been in the service since the 70s. We were about 14 miles into the backcountry, far beyond where a runner should have strayed, when the air changed. It didn't just get cold, it got heavy. It felt like walking through invisible cobwebs that coated your lungs. We stepped into a clearing that wasn't on any of our topographical maps. In the center of this clearing stood a freestanding door frame. No walls, no foundation, just a perfectly crafted mahogany door frame with a heavy oak door standing upright in the dirt. It looked brand new, polished to a mirror's shine, completely untouched by the sap, dirt, or rot of the forest. He whispered, "Don't look at it, Caleb. Don't even acknowledge it's there." We hiked 3 miles back in total silence before he let me stop. He never explained what it was, but when we got back to the station, the search for Elias was called off. The official report said presumed dead by animal attack, but we never found a single drop of blood or a shred of clothing. As the years went by, the anomalies became harder to ignore. You hear stories on the radio, whispers between rangers over coffee in the early hours before the sun hits the peaks. They talk about the mimics. I thought it was just hazing for the rookies until I spent a night in Lookout Tower 4. It was mid-November, the kind of cold that bites through 3 layers of wool. Around 2000 am, I heard a voice coming from the base of the tower. It was my mother's voice. She was calling my name, sounding distressed, asking me to come down and help her find her glasses. The problem was, my mother had been dead for 6 years, and she lived her entire life in Florida. She'd never even visited Montana. I sat there, clutching my service weapon, watching the thermal imaging scope. There was nothing down there. No heat signature, no movement, just the empty snow. But the voice continued for 3 hours, growing more frantic, eventually shifting into a sound that wasn't human, a rhythmic, clicking noise that mimicked the cadence of her speech but lost the tone. It sounded like a recording being played through a broken speaker. I didn't even blink. The incident that finally broke me happened in my final year. We received a report of a biological hazard near a remote creek bed in the restricted northern quadrant. When we arrived, the creek wasn't running clear. It was thick and black, like used motor oil, but it smelled like ozone and rotting meat. We followed the trail upstream and found a deer. Or at least it had been a deer. It was suspended 5 feet in the air, held up by nothing. It looked as if it had been turned inside out with surgical precision. Not a drop of blood was on the ground. It was just hanging there, a macabre floating sculpture of muscle and bone. I tried to radio it in, but my handheld unit just emitted a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. That's when I saw the man. He was standing on a ridge about 50 yards away, wearing a suit of charcoal gray, 3-piece business suit, no hiking gear, no coat, just a suit. He wasn't looking at the deer. He was looking at us. He didn't have a face. I don't mean he was wearing a mask. I mean where there should have been features, there was just smooth, pale skin, like a thumbprint that had been rubbed away. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just existed there, an impossibility in the middle of the wilderness. I didn't wait for orders. I grabbed Sarah by the vest and we ran. We didn't stop until we hit the trailhead 4 hours later. When I tried to file the report, my supervisor, a man I'd known for a decade, looked me in the eye and told me that if I ever mentioned the floating deer or the man in the suit again, my pension would be revoked and I'd be facing a psychological evaluation that would end my career. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. He knew, they all knew, the Forest Service isn't just there to protect the trees from us, they're there to protect us from what lives in the trees. There are places in this country, vast swaths of protected land, that are off limits for a reason. We call them national parks, but they're more like containment zones. We've built fences and put up signs, pretending we're the masters of the wild, but the wild has been here much longer than we have. It has its own rules, its own inhabitants, and its own way of dealing with trespassers. I live in a high-rise apartment in Seattle now. I don't even keep houseplants. People ask me why I gave up the dream job, why I left the fresh air and the mountain views for the smog and the noise of the city. I tell them I just wanted a change of pace. But the truth is, I need the noise. I need the sirens, the honking horns, and the hum of the electrical grid, because in the city, when you hear a voice calling your name from the shadows, you can tell yourself it's just a drunk or a neighbor. In the woods, when the birds go silent and the air gets heavy, you know exactly what's calling you, and you know that if you follow it, you're never coming back. The last thing I saw before I turned in my badge was a photo in the archives. It was a black and white shot from 1912, a group of loggers standing in front of a massive redwood. And there, standing in the back of the crowd, was the man in the charcoal suit. He looked exactly the same. No face, no age, just a void in the shape of a man. I realized then that we aren't exploring the wilderness. We're just visiting a place that doesn't want us there, and eventually the wilderness is going to stop asking us to leave and start making us stay. I still have dreams about that mahogany door in the clearing. In my dreams, I don't turn around. I walk up to it, I turn the handle, and I see what's on the other side. And every time, right before the door swings open, I wake up screaming, the smell of ozone filling my bedroom, and the sound of my mother's voice whispering my name from the hallway. I don't go into the woods anymore. And if you're smart, you'll stay on the paved roads, because once you step off the trail, you're not in our world anymore. You're in theirs. The files I saw, the ones they didn't think I'd find, spoke of the transversals. That was the internal name for the anomalies. They aren't ghosts, and they aren't aliens. They are something much older, a byproduct of the Earth itself. The report suggested that certain areas of high tectonic pressure or ancient geological formations act as thin spots. In these places, the physical laws we take for granted simply don't apply. Gravity fluctuates, time dilates. Biology becomes fluid. I remember reading about a search and rescue mission in the 1980s where a team found a missing child inside a hollowed-out cedar tree. The child was fine, but he claimed he'd been gone for an hour. In reality, he'd been missing for 3 weeks. The strangest part, he was wearing clothes that didn't belong to him. Clothes that were dated from the late 1800s, perfectly preserved, as if they'd just come off the clothesline. The boy died 2 days later of natural causes. The autopsy showed his internal organs had aged 60 years and 48 hours. They don't tell you these things because if people knew the truth about the national parks, the tourism industry would collapse overnight. Billions of dollars in revenue would vanish. So they maintain the illusion. They give us the brochures, the campsites, and the guided tours. They keep us in the safe zones, the places where the reality is still thick enough to hold. But every year, the thin spots grow. Every year, more people walk into the trees and never come out. I've spent the last few months tracking the missing person statistics. The numbers don't add up. Thousands of people vanish in the wilderness every year. And while many are found, a significant percentage disappear under impossible circumstances. No tracks, no scent for the dogs, no logical explanation. If you look at a map of the disappearances and overlay it with a map of the cave systems and the thin spots I identified during my time as a ranger, the correlation is 100%. I'm writing this not to scare you, but to warn you. The woods are beautiful, yes. They are majestic and soul-stirring. But they are also predatory. They are a living, breathing entity that requires a sacrifice every now and then to keep the balance. We are the intruders. We are the ones breaking the silence. And eventually, the silence is going to break us back. I remember my final conversation with my supervisor the day I handed in my gear. He didn't ask me to stay, he didn't offer a raise, he just looked at me with those hollowed-out eyes and said, "You're one of the lucky ones, Caleb. You're leaving with your mind intact. Most of us don't." I asked him what he meant, but he just turned back to his paperwork. As I walked out of the station for the last time, I looked back at the tree line. The sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the valley. And for a split second I saw it, a flash of mahogany in the distance, a door standing open, waiting for the next person to wander off the path. I drove 6 hours that night, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I sat there for 3 hours, drinking burnt coffee and listening to the beautiful mundane chatter of people talking about their taxes, their kids, and their jobs. It was the most wonderful sound I'd ever heard. So, if you're planning a trip this summer, if you're looking to get away from it all and immerse yourself in nature, do yourself a favor. Stay on the trail. Don't go out after dark. And if you hear a voice that sounds like someone you love calling you from the deep brush, or if you see something that shouldn't be there, a staircase, a door, a man in a suit, don't stop, don't look, just run. Run until you hit the pavement and don't ever look back. Because the forest is always watching, and it has a very long memory. I still keep my old service flashlight in my nightstand. It's a habit I can't break. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the city gets too quiet, I flick it on just to make sure the walls of my apartment are still solid, that the floor is still wood and not dirt, and that there are no mahogany frames standing in the corners of my room. It's a small comfort, but it's all I have. The woods are still out there, waiting at the edge of the map, and I know that somewhere, deep in the Bitterroot, another ranger is hearing a voice he shouldn't hear. And he's starting to realize that the unexplained isn't just a category of file, it's a warning. Story 7. I found a door in the middle of a forest that had no business being there, and the worst part wasn't that it was locked, it was that it was breathing. I'm Marcus Miller, a 34-year-old land surveyor currently working the deepest, most unforgiving grids of the Cascade Mountains in Washington. My job is usually boring. It's mostly just me, a high-end GPS rig, a lot of bug spray, and the endless, repetitive rhythm of marking boundaries that haven't been touched since the 1970s. I'm used to the silence. I'm used to the isolation, but 3 weeks ago, I found something that made me realize that some parts of the American wilderness aren't just empty. They're waiting. The day started out like any other. I was about 12 miles from the nearest logging road, pushing into a valley that the locals call the Throat because of the way the mist gets trapped between the ridges. It's a dense, suffocating place where the Douglas firs grow so thick they blot out the sun by 3 in the afternoon. My task was to verify a historical property line for a private estate, a job that should have taken 4 hours but ended up consuming my life. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Now, you have to understand, the woods are never actually silent. There's always the chatter of squirrels, the distant tap of a woodpecker, or the rustle of wind through the canopy. But as I crossed a small stagnant creek, the sound just died. It was like stepping into a soundproof booth. The air felt heavy, charged with the static tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. I checked my GPS, and for the first time in 10 years of fieldwork, the screen was just a jumble of digital static. That's when I saw it. Tucked into a natural alcove of jagged rock and weeping hemlocks was a cabin. It didn't look like the kind of rustic getaway you see on Instagram. It was built from logs that looked charred, even though there was no sign of a forest fire in this sector. The roof was sagging under the weight of a century's worth of moss, and the windows were made of that old, wavy glass that makes everything on the other side look like it's underwater. I stood there for a long time, just watching it. My gut was screaming at me to turn around, to mark the plot as inaccessible, and get back to my truck. But curiosity is a hell of a drug, especially when you're alone in the woods. I approached the porch, the wood groaning under my boots with a sound like a long-forgotten language. The door was the most unsettling part. It was made of solid oak, reinforced with iron straps, and as I reached for the handle, I felt a rhythmic vibration. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't my pulse, it was coming from the wood itself. The door was warm, almost feverish. I should have walked away then. I really should have. But the door wasn't locked. It creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan, inviting me into the dark. The interior of the cabin was a time capsule, but a distorted one. There was a table set for 4, ceramic plates, tarnished silver, and crystal glasses that caught the slivers of gray light filtering through the grime-covered windows. But the food on the plates, it wasn't rotten. There was a loaf of bread that looked like it had been pulled from the oven 10 minutes ago, steam still lazily curling into the air. Beside it sat a bowl of deep red berries, plump and glistening with moisture. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded flat, swallowed by the shadows. No one answered. I walked further in, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The cabin was larger on the inside than it appeared from the outside, a spatial impossibility that made my head spin. I found myself in a hallway that seemed to stretch back into the mountain itself. The walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of them, all in ornate silver frames. I leaned in to look at one. It was a family, a father, a mother, and 2 young daughters, standing in front of this very cabin. They were dressed in 19th century attire, but their faces had been meticulously scratched out, replaced by a black ink-like substance that seemed to swirl if I looked at it too long. I moved to the next photo. It was a man in a 1940s military uniform. His face was gone, too. Then a woman from the 70s holding a camera, same thing. As I moved down the line, the photos became more modern. I saw a hiker from the 90s, a group of teenagers from the early 2000s, and then my heart stopped. The last photo in the row was me. It was a picture of me standing at the creek just 20 minutes ago, looking at my malfunctioning GPS. My face was still there, but the black ink was already beginning to seep in from the edges of the frame, slowly encroaching on my eyes. A cold dread washed over me, the kind that turns your blood to slush. I turned to run, but the hallway had changed. The door I had entered through was gone. In its place was a wall of that same charred wood, and the thump-thump of the cabin's heartbeat was getting louder, faster. The floorboards began to pulse. The walls seemed to be contracting, the ceiling lowering inch by inch. I panicked. I started kicking at the walls, screaming for help, but the wood was like iron. I ran back toward the kitchen, hoping to find another way out. The table was still there, but the steam from the bread had turned into a thick, choking fog, and sitting at the table were the people from the photos. They weren't ghosts, not exactly. They looked like wax figures that had been left in the sun, their features blurred and melting. They sat perfectly still, their faceless heads turned toward the center of the table. The father figure raised a hand, his fingers elongated and gray, and pointed toward the cellar door in the corner of the room. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct I had told me that the cellar was the stomach of this place. But the walls were closing in so fast now that the hallway was barely 3 feet wide. The windows had vanished. The only light came from the cellar door, which was glowing with a faint, sickly green hue. I lunged for the cellar door, ripped it open, and tumbled down a flight of stone steps. I expected a basement, a coal room, anything normal. What I found was a cavern. The cabin wasn't built on the ground, it was built on top of a massive, glowing fissure in the earth. The heartbeat I had been hearing was coming from a central mass of organic material. A pulsing, viney heart the size of a car, suspended over the abyss by thick, root-like tendons. Wrapped in those tendons were people. They were being kept alive, their bodies fused with the wood and the stone, their eyes wide and vacant as they fed the heart with whatever remained of their souls. I saw the hiker from the photo. I saw the girls from the 1800s. They were all part of the cabin now. One of the roots lashed out, snagging my ankle. The grip was cold and felt like wet leather. It started pulling me toward the central mass, the heartbeat accelerating into a frantic drum roll. I reached for the survey hatchet on my belt, the one tool I hadn't dropped in my panic, and swung with everything I had. The wood bled. A thick, black ichor sprayed across my face, smelling of old copper and rotted lilies. The scream that tore through the cavern wasn't human. It was the sound of 1,000 trees snapping at once. The grip on my ankle loosened, and I scrambled back up the stone stairs. The cabin was thrashing. The walls were buckling, the charred logs splintering as the entity beneath them buckled in pain. I didn't look for a door this time. I ran straight for a gap in the splintering wood where a window used to be and threw myself through it. I hit the forest floor hard, the air driven from my lungs. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until the soles of my boots tore, until the oppressive silence of the throat was finally broken by the beautiful mundane sound of a distant highway. When I finally made it back to my truck, I didn't call the police. What would I say? That a house tried to eat me. I drove straight to the office, handed in my resignation, and moved 3 states away. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. I still have my camera from that day. I was too afraid to look at the said card for weeks, but curiosity eventually won. I plugged it in and looked at the last few files. There are no pictures of a cabin. There are no pictures of a glowing cavern. The last photo on my card is a shot of me, taken from high up in the trees. I'm standing in a clearing, staring at nothing but a circle of dead, blackened grass. My GPS is in my hand, and I'm smiling. But in the photo, my eyes are already gone, replaced by 2 perfect circles of black ink. I'm looking at my reflection in the computer monitor right now. My eyes look normal. They're brown, just like they've always been. But sometimes, when the room is quiet and the wind catches the corner of my house just right, I can feel a vibration in my chest. Thump, 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 thump. And I can't help but wonder if I ever actually left those woods. Or if the thing in the cabin is just finished developing the film. If you're ever hiking in the Cascades and you find a place where the birds don't sing, don't look for the cabin, don't look for the door, because by the time you see it, it's already taken your picture. And once the ink starts to spread, there's nowhere left to run.